The water was already at the wagon wheels when Lavinia Monroe realized Thomas Quinn intended to drive straight into the heart of the flood. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into the rough canvas of his coat sleeve, her voice cracking with something between fury and raw terror. "Thomas, stop this. Stop the wagon right now. You cannot drive into that current. It will take us both under." He did not stop. He did not even look at her. His jaw was set like iron, his hands gripping the reins of the two draft horses with a steadiness that defied every instinct a sane man should have owned in that moment. The Arkansas River had broken its banks 3 days into a storm that the old-timers in Coldwater Creek, Kansas, had not seen in 40 years. The crossing that normally took 7 minutes of gentle ford had become a churning, brown-muscled beast of a river, pulling fence posts and dead cottonwood trees through its belly like a man swallowing bones. "You are not crossing this alone," Thomas said, and those were the only words he offered, and they hit Lavinia somewhere deep in her chest with a force she was not prepared for. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tell him that she had been crossing things alone for 5 years, that she did not need a man with a secret she had only just discovered to play the role of hero when the truth of what he had done was still raw and bleeding between them. She had found the letter that morning, tucked beneath the false bottom of her cedar chest where no man's hand had any business being. The letter that told her exactly who Thomas Quinn had been before he arrived in Coldwater Creek, before he bought the land adjacent to hers, before he became the only neighbor she trusted, before she made the catastrophic mistake of falling in love with him. The horses lurched forward, their haunches bunching with effort as the wagon's front wheels dropped into the deeper current, and Lavinia grabbed the seat board with both hands and held on, because there was nothing else she could do. That was the moment she understood something about Thomas Quinn that she had not been willing to admit before. A man with a hidden motive would have let her drown. 6 weeks earlier, Lavinia Monroe had arrived in Coldwater Creek with 2 horses, a covered wagon loaded with everything she owned, and a determination that she wore like armor because she could not afford to wear anything softer. She was 28 years old, a widow of 2 years, and she had used every dollar of the life insurance payment from her late husband Gerald Monroe's railroad accident to purchase 160 acres of Kansas grassland under the Homestead Act, which in 1878 still required a widow to prove she could work the land herself or hire men enough to work it for her. She had no men to hire. She had $72 left after the land purchase, a small herd of 12 Hereford cattle she had driven herself from Wichita with the help of a 13-year-old boy named Pete Gibbs who left her service at the county line, and a profound, burning refusal to fail at this. Gerald had been a kind man but a reckless one, and his recklessness had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back and the insurance money, and a name that still carried some dignity in a world that was not built to be kind to women standing alone. She had pulled her wagon up to the property on a Tuesday in late August, the heat so thick and yellow it seemed to have weight, the grass stretching out in every direction like something God had unrolled in a hurry. There was a small soddy on the land, built by the previous claimant who had abandoned it after 2 dry summers, and it was in poor repair but not beyond saving. Lavinia had stood at the door of that soddy for a long time, looking at the crumbling sod walls and the grass roof that had begun to curl back at the corners, and she had made herself a quiet and private promise that she would not cry. She did not cry. She was pulling rotted wood from the door frame with a pry bar on her second day when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the east, and she straightened up and faced them with the pry bar still in her hand and her eyes steady, because a woman alone on the frontier learned quickly that how you stood when a stranger arrived mattered as much as whether you had a weapon. The man who rode up was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulder, with the kind of unhurried way of moving that spoke either of great confidence or great fatigue, and she could not tell which immediately. He had dark hair that was a little too long at the collar, eyes the color of a river in deep shade, somewhere between green and gray and brown depending on how the light hit them, and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something that was not classically handsome but was deeply, specifically arresting. He wore working clothes, worn but clean, and he had a cattle brand burned into the left rear hip of his horse that she would later learn meant the Quinn spread, which began roughly a quarter-mile east of her property line. He pulled up about 20 feet from her and touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers. "Thomas Quinn," he said, "I run the spread to your east. I came to offer some help with that door frame if you want it." Lavinia looked at him for a moment, measuring. She had learned to measure men quickly, not out of distrust exactly, but out of necessity. The West was full of men who offered help and expected payment in kinds she was not willing to offer. "I have a pry bar," she said. "I can see that." He did not smile, but something around his eyes shifted slightly, like the beginning of a smile being reconsidered. "I have a better one and a level, and about 3 hours before I need to be back to check on the calving I have going on the south pasture." She had looked at the door frame and at the pry bar in her hand and at the man on the horse. "Lavinia Monroe," she said finally, and stood back from the door to let him get to work. He had not tried to take the pry bar from her. That was the first thing she noticed. He brought his own from his saddlebag and worked alongside her, showing her without condescension where the rot had set deepest into the jamb, and how to cut it back to sound wood before the frame would hold new material. He spoke only when speech was useful. He answered her questions directly, without the hedge of masculine qualification she had grown accustomed to from men who assumed she was asking in order to be impressed rather than in order to learn. He did not ask her why she was alone, or where her husband was, or whether she had family coming to help her. When the door frame was stripped and sound, he replaced the old wood with cedar planks from his saddlebag, cedar being what he happened to have, and he fitted them with a precision that was almost beautiful to watch. He was a man who knew how to use his hands. Lavinia watched him work and felt something stir in her chest that she immediately pressed down, because she was not in Coldwater Creek to feel things stirring in her chest. She was there to build something lasting. He left before sundown, touching his hat brim again, and she watched him ride east along the property line and told herself firmly that he was just a neighbor, and she was just a woman alone in a new place, and the warmth she felt watching him go was simply gratitude for the door frame, nothing more complicated than that. She saw him the following week at the general store in the town of Coldwater Creek proper, which was 4 miles north and consisted of a general store, a post office, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a livery stable, a small church, and a doctor's office that the doctor occupied only on Tuesdays. He was buying fence wire and did not see her at first, and she had a full 10 seconds to observe him without his awareness, to notice how he moved through a crowded room with a kind of careful consideration of the space around him, stepping out of other people's paths without being asked, making himself smaller for a large man in a way that felt habitual rather than forced. Then he saw her and he nodded and said, "Mrs. Monroe," with the same economy of expression he used for everything, and she said, "Mr. Quinn," and they went about their business separately. But when she came out to her wagon with her purchased goods and found that one of her horses had worked itself loose from the hitching post and wandered 20 yards down the street, Thomas Quinn was the one who had caught the animal by the bridle and was holding it with a patience the horse was testing aggressively. He handed her the reins without a word about it, and she found she could not let that go without something more than silence. "Thank you," she said. "She does that when she is nervous. Too much noise." "Most sensible creatures do," he said, and she had laughed before she could stop herself. A real laugh, the kind that caught her off guard, and when she looked at him his face had that almost smile again, slightly wider this time, and there was something in his eyes that was warm and complicated and quickly shuddered. She thought about that look for 3 days afterward and was annoyed with herself about it. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that build things slowly, like sediment, layer by layer, almost invisible until suddenly there is a canyon. Thomas Quinn appeared at her property on a Saturday morning, with two other hands from his spread to help her repair the south wall of the soddy before the autumn rains set in. And he had the decency to send a boy ahead to ask permission first rather than simply arriving. She gave it, and they worked for 6 hours and ate the lunch she made from what little she had, beans and salt pork and cornbread, and the hands ate gratefully, and said it was fine cooking, and Thomas ate quietly, and told her afterward, privately and without the others hearing, that the cornbread was the best he had eaten since his mother's. And the simplicity of that confidence, the fact that it was not a performance but just the truth as he saw it, moved her more than a more elaborate compliment would have. She began to understand that Thomas Quinn was a man of enormous internal restraint. He was not cold, but he was contained. The depth of feeling he carried was visible only in moments, in the brief unguarded stretches when he thought no one was looking, in the way he handled injured or frightened animals, in the particular quality of his silence when something moved him. She began to look for those moments, which was a dangerous habit, and she knew it and kept doing it anyway. In September the rains arrived, and with them came the isolation that was the frontier's great test. A woman alone in a soddy on 160 acres was a woman alone with herself and her thoughts and her cattle and the sound of rain on grass. Lavinia had thought herself prepared for that. She was not. The loneliness was not the sharp, screaming kind she had expected, but the slow, grinding kind. The kind that wore away at the corners of your certainty, until you were not sure anymore why you had come or what you were building, or whether the building mattered to anyone but you. Thomas came by on the third Tuesday of that September, ostensibly to check whether the flooding around the seasonal creek at the north edge of her property had reached her pasture fence, which was a legitimate concern. He had a reason for being there. He always had a reason for being there, and she had started to wonder whether the reasons were as incidental as they appeared or whether they were careful, considered, quietly intentional. He found her on the south side of the soddy stacking wood that had gotten wet, which was pointless work, the kind of work you did when you needed to be doing something. He looked at her for a moment. The rain had stopped that morning, but the sky was the color of pewter, and the air had a cold bite to it that November would only sharpen. He did not offer to help with the wood. He said instead, "When did you last have a conversation that was not with your cattle?" She had intended to say something dismissive. What came out was the truth. 5 days, she said. Maybe 6. I lose count. He had sat down on the splitting log at the woodpile's edge without being invited and pulled his hat off and turned it in his hands, which was the closest she had seen him come to nervous, and said, "Would you like company then? I can go back and come again with a reason if you need one, but I thought I would just ask." She had stared at him, and her chest had done the stirring thing again, and she had said, company would be welcome, and sat down across from him on an upturned bucket, and they had talked for 2 hours in the cold gray afternoon about things she had not talked about in months, about what they both wanted to build, about what the land meant, about how the frontier was both the most honest place and the most brutal one, and how those things were not unrelated. About small things, too. A hawk he had watched for a week from his east pasture, a book she had read twice on the Wagon trail west, the particular quality of silence at 3 in the morning in open country that was different from any other silence in the world. He had not tried to hold her hand or touch her face or close the distance between them in any physical way, and she had been aware of this absence as its own kind of presence, as its own deliberate and respectful statement, and she had found it more devastating to her composure than any touch would have been. October arrived, and the rhythm of their company became something she depended on, which frightened her. He came by twice a week, on Tuesdays and Saturdays, always with a reason that was real but secondary, always with that particular quality of attention he gave her that was different from how she had ever been attended to before. Gerald Monroe had been loving in a loud, expansive, somewhat careless way. Thomas Quinn's attention was the opposite. It was quiet and precise, and it made her feel like she was the only solid thing in a large and shifting landscape. She had begun, by October's end, to think about kissing him. This was inconvenient, and she treated it accordingly, filing it away in the back of her mind, where she kept the things she did not have the luxury of acting on. She was building a life here. She had 12 head of cattle to expand into a viable herd before spring. She had a soddy that needed serious weatherproofing before the real cold came. She had practical problems that required practical solutions, and Thomas Quinn's mouth and the particular way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching were not things she had time to address. But the heart does not consult the schedule, and the frontier had a way of compressing time and stripping away everything that was not essential until what remained was what was actually true. The evening it shifted was a Thursday in November, which was not a Tuesday or Saturday, which was therefore a departure. She had heard his horse and gone to the door and found him standing in the dark with a lantern because his mare had thrown a shoe about a mile up the road, and he had walked her in rather than risk the horse on uneven ground in the dark. And could Lavinia spare a place to put the horse overnight? And if it was not too much of an imposition, a corner of the barn floor for himself. She had looked at him in the lantern light, this contained, careful man who had walked a horse a mile in the dark rather than risk injuring it, whose hair was damp from the cold mist, whose face was tired in a way that it never was in daylight when he was being deliberate, and she had felt something in her chest break open like a door that had been held shut for a long time finally giving way. "I have a proper barn floor," she said, "and I can do better than a corner. I have a cot in the back of the soddy from when I brought Pete Gibbs along from Wichita. You can sleep on that." She made coffee, because that was what you did, and they sat at the small table inside the soddy with the wind going at the walls and the lantern between them, and at some point the conversation simply stopped, and they were looking at each other with the particular directness of people who have run out of pretense, and Thomas put his coffee cup down and said, "Lavinia, I need you to know that I am not a simple man. My history is not uncomplicated. There are things about my past that I would need to tell you before this goes any further, and I intend to tell you, but I want to be honest first about what this is for me, which is that I am very seriously in danger of being in love with you, and I thought you should know that before we discuss the rest." The silence that followed was enormous. She said, "How much danger?" he said. "Considerable." She had reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, just that, just the contact, and felt him go very still in the way that very controlled people go still when something reaches through the control and touches the real thing underneath. He turned his hand over slowly and held hers, and they sat like that for a long time without moving or speaking, and it was the most intimate thing she had experienced in years. They did not kiss that night. He slept on the cot in the back of the soddy, and she lay in her bed and listened to the wind and felt the specific exquisite terror of someone standing at the beginning of something that could either be the best or the worst thing of her life. In the morning he fixed the horse's shoe himself with her farrier tools, because he knew how, and he left with a look that contained a full and complicated conversation that neither of them was ready to have yet. He came back on Saturday with his history, as promised. He told her over 2 hours of careful, uncomfortable honesty that before he had come to Coldwater Creek 4 years ago, he had been a deputy marshal in the town of Abilene, which was not the troubling part. The troubling part was what had come before the marshaling. He had, at 19, ridden with a cattle outfit owned by a man named Elias Creed, and Elias Creed was a man whose cattle acquisition methods were not always strictly legal, meaning that some portion of the herd he drove to market in those years had been bought but a larger portion had not. Thomas had not known this initially. He had known it by the time he was 21, and he had nonetheless stayed with the outfit for another 8 months before his conscience made the situation untenable, and he walked away with only his horse and his saddle and $30 he had earned legitimately. He had spent the following 3 years as a ranch hand doing honest work and building his name back into something he could bear to look at. And then he had entered the Marshal Service, where he served for 6 years with sufficient distinction that his prior association with Creed was not a matter of public record in Coldwater Creek, though it was not entirely erased from his past. He had used the savings from his marshal's salary to buy the Quinn spread outright, with clear title, and he had been building the cattle operation honestly for 4 years. What he did not tell her, because he did not know it yet himself, was that Elias Creed was not entirely finished with Thomas Quinn. Lavinia had listened to all of this without interruption. She was a fair woman, and she understood that a man's history and a man's character were related but not identical, that what a person became mattered alongside what they had once been. And Thomas Quinn's history, laid out in his careful and unflinching way, was the history of a man who had made a serious error in moral judgment when he was young, and had spent the intervening decade building his way back from it. Which was not so different from things she could have said about herself given enough honesty. What she said was, "Are there things about Elias Creed that are still unresolved between you?" He had hesitated, just briefly, and that hesitation was the thing she would remember later. "Not that I know of," he said. "Then I appreciate your telling me," she said, "and I appreciate that you told me yourself rather than letting me find it some other way." He had kissed her for the first time that afternoon, which was nothing like she had expected, meaning it was not desperate or theatrical or complicated. It was quiet and very careful, and it tasted like coffee and cold air. And when he pulled back and looked at her, his eyes had that unguarded quality she had been watching for since August, that depth of feeling not hidden for once, and she felt the full terrifying weight of how much she already cared about this man. They moved into each other's company with the same measured deliberateness that characterized everything Thomas Quinn did, which was a quality that Lavinia's nature both respected and occasionally chafed against, because she was, underneath the self-sufficiency and the composure, a woman of considerable passion who had been keeping it reined in for so long that it had its own kind of pressure. November moved into December, and December meant the isolation deepened, and the cold set in with real conviction, the kind of Kansas cold that had teeth and was not apologetic about it. Lavinia's herd had expanded to 15 head through the careful purchase of 3 additional animals at the fall stock sale, and she was managing the winter feeding and the soddy maintenance and the endless small crises of frontier life with a competence she was quietly proud of. Thomas helped when help was warranted and did not when it was not, which was the right balance, and she recognized it as such. They were careful with each other in the way that people who have both been damaged by previous losses tend to be careful with new things they value. There was a particular conversation they kept almost having and then stepping back from, about the future, about what was building between them, about whether this was moving toward something permanent. The frontier made those conversations both more urgent and more fraught, because permanence in this place was not guaranteed by anything, and you could pour your heart into a person or a piece of land and lose it to drought or disease or sheer bad fortune before the ink was dry on any promise. The letter arrived in the first week of January. It came addressed to Thomas Quinn at the Coldwater Creek post office, and it was from a man named Cal Deering, who was Elias Creed's enforcer and had been for 20 years, and it was addressed to Thomas, but it arrived into Lavinia's hands first by accident and then by intention. The accident was that the postmaster, old Mr. Hemming, who was 3/4 deaf and 100% overworked, sorted the mail by first name rather than last that particular Tuesday, meaning the letter addressed to Thomas arrived in Lavinia Monroe's box alongside a seed catalog and a note from her cousin in St. Louis. She had opened it before she noticed the name on the envelope, because the envelope was not sealed properly and the flap had simply lifted in the cold, dry air. The intention was what happened next, which was that once she had read the first 2 lines, she could not stop reading. The letter said, in Cal Deering's blunt and barely literate hand, that Elias Creed knew Thomas Quinn was running cattle in Coldwater Creek, and knew he had found himself a comfortable life and a woman to be comfortable with, and that Creed had a proposal for Thomas that was not really a proposal in the sense of being optional. The letter said that Creed needed one final favor from Thomas, which was the knowledge of the route and schedule of the cattle drive that the Coldwater Creek Cattlemen's Association was planning for spring, specifically the route through the eastern passage of the Flint Hills, because a man with that information could relieve the drive of a significant number of animals before they reached the stockyards in Wichita, and Creed was offering Thomas a percentage of the proceeds in exchange for his information, which was a generous offer given that Creed's alternative was to make Thomas Quinn's prior association with the Creed outfit a matter of public and legal record, which would result in the loss of Thomas's land title through fraud investigation, since his marshal salary had partly come from a service that might question his prior affiliations given the right kind of pressure in the right kind of ears. It was a trap. It was blackmail. It was Elias Creed reaching a long arm back through time to drag Thomas Quinn into a darkness he had spent a decade climbing out of. And Lavinia Monroe, standing in the cold outside the Coldwater Creek post office with the letter in her shaking hands, felt the world shift beneath her feet in 2 different directions at once. The first direction was fear for Thomas, clean and immediate and instinctive, the fear of someone who loved a person and saw danger bearing down on them. The second direction was the dark, whispering thing that she was ashamed of even as she felt it, which was the question of whether Thomas's hesitation in November, that brief pause when she had asked whether things with Creed were unresolved, had been the hesitation of a man who was not entirely sure, or the hesitation of a man who already knew about this letter and had not told her. She resealed the letter as best she could and took it home and spent 2 days alone with it, which were 2 of the longest and most painful days of her life, because in that solitude she had to reckon with what she actually believed about Thomas Quinn and why she believed it, and whether her belief was rooted in evidence or in the vulnerability of loving someone. On the 3rd day she rode to his spread and gave him the letter. She watched his face as he read it, and she was watching for specific things, for the particular quality of shock that was genuine versus the particular quality of someone performing surprise. What she saw was real. She was certain of it. The color left his face and returned in a different shade, a tightness around his eyes and mouth that was the physical expression of a man confronting a thing he had believed was behind him and finding it ahead. He read it twice and then he set it down and looked at her. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 2 days, she said. He absorbed that. "You thought about it for 2 days before you brought it to me." "I needed to know what I believed," she said honestly. "And what do you believe?" "I believe you did not know this was coming. I believe your hesitation in November was uncertainty, not concealment. I believe that if you had known, you would have told me." She paused. "I needed 2 days to be sure I believed that for real and not just because I wanted to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for those 2 days and for this," and picked up the letter. The problem of Elias Creed was real and it required a real solution. Thomas could not ignore the letter. He could not comply with it. He could not simply alert the local marshal without risking the investigation that Creed was using as leverage. And he could not run because running was not in his nature and would only delay the problem while destroying the life he had built. What he did instead was begin a correspondence with a former colleague in the Marshal's service, a man named Robert Fitch, who was now a federal marshal out of Topeka, who had known Thomas Quinn for 12 years and whose respect for him was not dependent on a clean prior record. Thomas told Fitch everything in a letter of considerable length and honesty, including the prior association with Creed, including the blackmail letter, including his genuine desire to ensure that Creed's current operation was brought to federal attention in a way that would serve justice rather than Thomas's personal convenience. It took 3 weeks for the response to arrive, 3 weeks during which Thomas and Lavinia continued their careful, deepening courtship with an additional layer of strain underneath it, a shared secret, and a shared threat that both of them carried with the particular weight of something that had not yet resolved itself. The storm arrived before Fitch's response did. It came in from the southwest on the third Monday of February 1879, which was an unusual direction for a winter storm and an unusual time of year for the kind of rainfall it delivered. But Kansas weather was not subject to convention, and the rain that began on Monday afternoon was still falling on Wednesday morning with no sign of relenting. The seasonal creek that ran along the north edge of Lavinia's property had been rising since Tuesday, and by Wednesday noon it had become something that called for urgent decisions. Lavinia's cattle were on the north pasture, which was the worst place for them to be with the creek climbing. She needed to move them to the south pasture, and she needed to do it before the flood reached the fence line, and she needed to cross the creek herself first to assess the actual pasture condition, because the south pasture dipped in the center and could pool. To assess it, to move the cattle properly, to accomplish any of this in the time available, she needed to take her wagon across the ford on the north road, which was the only solid crossing within 2 miles of her property. She was harnessing her 2 draft horses when Thomas arrived. He had come across the property line on horseback through the rain to check on her, which she had come to accept as something he would do, and he pulled up at the barn door and read the situation in about 3 seconds. "The ford is flooding," he said. "I know. I need to get across before it goes worse. Lavinia, the Arkansas is running high above Wichita. They came through the Coldwater Creek yesterday afternoon with the report of it. This is not a normal crossing this morning." She knew this. She had heard the report as well. She also knew that her cattle were on the wrong side of her property and that losing them to a flood she could have prevented by acting would be a catastrophe she could not financially survive. 12 head of cattle were her entire investment, her entire future in this place. She looked at him with the full weight of that reality in her face, and he looked back at her with his, and they understood each other completely. "Then I will drive you across," he said. "Get in the wagon. Thomas, this is not your fight to have." "You are not crossing that ford alone," he said, and the flatness of it, the absolute absence of negotiation or heroics in how he said it, was the most compelling argument he could have made. He was not offering to be her savior. He was stating a fact about how things were going to go. She got in the wagon. The water was at the wheels when she grabbed his arm and told him to stop, and he said, "You are not crossing this alone." And she felt those words land in the deepest part of her chest. And then the horses lurched forward and they were in the current, and everything was motion and sound and cold, and the fierce, grinding effort of those 2 big horses against the pull of the river. Thomas handled the reins with a concentration that was total and almost frightening in its stillness, reading the current, adjusting the angle of the crossing with tiny, precise movements, talking to the horses in a low, continuous voice that was steady as a heartbeat, while the water climbed the wagon's running boards. And then over the floor, and Lavinia gripped the seat with both hands and watched his hands on the reins, and thought with absolute clarity that she was going to love this man for the rest of her life. There was a moment, about 2/3 of the way across, when the current caught the wagon's rear and tried to swing it downstream, and Thomas responded with an immediate, forceful shift in the reins that redirected the horses without alarming them, and the wagon straightened, and Lavinia felt the breath rush back into her lungs that she had not realized she was holding. They came out the other side with water still draining from the wagon bed, both horses blowing hard, Thomas Quinn as wet as if he had swum it. He brought the horses to a stop and sat for a moment with the reins loose in his hands, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a count of about 5 seconds, and then she put her hand on the side of his face, which was cold and wet and stubbled with 3 days of beard, and she felt him lean into that contact with something that was almost imperceptible but was absolutely there. And she thought, there you are. There is the real thing under all that restraint. And she kept her hand there until he turned his face slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, which was the most tender thing she had ever experienced in her life. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You are welcome," he said, and picked up the reins, and they went to move her cattle. It took 4 hours to move all 15 head from the north pasture to the south, working in the rain with the creek still climbing, Thomas on horseback and Lavinia on foot at critical moments, both of them soaked through and muddy to the knee. But the cattle were moved, and the fence on the south pasture gate was secured before the north fence went under. Standing at the gate of the south pasture watching the last cow settle into the new pasture, Lavinia felt a fierce and particular joy that was compounded of exhaustion and relief, and the fact of Thomas Quinn standing beside her having just helped her save everything she had built, and she turned to him and said, "Will you marry me?" Because she was tired of waiting, and the frontier had taught her that time was not a resource to be wasted. He turned and looked at her with rain running down his face and his expression doing that thing again, that particular unguarding. Then he said, "I was going to ask you on Sunday. It is Wednesday, 4 days earlier than planned. Is the answer different because it is 4 days earlier?" He looked at her for another moment and then said, "No," simply and completely. And she laughed, and he caught the laugh by kissing her in the rain, properly this time, with no restraint and no careful deliberation and no measured distance, which was the first time she had felt the full, uncontained force of what he felt for her, and it was rather staggering. The response from Robert Fitch arrived the following week. Fitch had done his work quietly and thoroughly in the 3 weeks since Thomas's letter, and the news was not entirely comfortable, but it was manageable. There was, in the federal record, a notation regarding Thomas Quinn's association with the Creed outfit during his youth, but it was classified as a witness status notation rather than a criminal one, meaning that in 1874, when a federal investigation into Elias Creed's operation had first opened, Thomas Quinn had been interviewed and had cooperated fully with investigators at considerable personal risk. This cooperation was the reason his subsequent entry into the Marshal Service had been approved despite the association, and it was also the reason Elias Creed harbored a particular animosity toward Thomas that went beyond mere opportunity. Creed did not just want Thomas's information about the cattle drive. He wanted Thomas ruined. The blackmail was never going to end after one compliance. Fitch knew this, had seen this pattern before, and he had a proposal. He wanted Thomas to write back to Cal Deering and agree to the meeting, under the condition that the meeting would be arranged at a location of Thomas's choosing, with federal marshals positioned accordingly. It was a dangerous plan. It required Thomas to play the role of someone willing to betray his neighbors in order to draw Creed's people into a situation where they could be arrested, and it required him to carry that performance through a face-to-face meeting with men who had known him and might read him too well. He brought the letter to Lavinia, and they talked about it for 3 hours. She did not tell him not to do it. She told him what she saw, which was that the alternative was a life spent looking over his shoulder, and a man who spent his life looking backward could not build forward. And she had not ridden all the way from Wichita to the Kansas frontier to build her life with a man who was only partly present. She also said that she was frightened, and she said it plainly without softening it, because she thought he deserved her actual feelings rather than a performance of courage she did not entirely feel. He held her face in his hands when she said the frightened part and looked at her for a long moment. "I have spent a long time being afraid of this," he said. "The past catching up. I think I am more afraid of not doing this than of doing it." She put her hands over his. "Then do it," she said, "and come back." The arrangement of the meeting took 2 weeks of careful correspondence, every letter written and rewritten by Thomas with Fitch's guidance, the performance maintained with the same steadiness he brought to everything. The meeting was set for a Saturday in late February at the Deering Creek Station, which was a small waypoint about 8 miles south of Coldwater Creek, isolated enough to seem a plausible choice for a secret exchange, and accessible enough for the 4 federal marshals Fitch was bringing up from Topeka. Thomas rode out before dawn, and Lavinia stood in the doorway of the soddy and watched him go and had a specific, vivid conversation with herself about the nature of faith, which was not the religious kind but the practical kind, the kind that required you to let a person you loved move toward danger because the alternative was a cage, and love was not a cage, and she knew that, and knowing it did not make the watching any easier. He came back that evening with a cut on his cheekbone where Cal Deering had introduced himself with a fist before the marshals closed in, and with the news that both Deering and 2 of Creed's other men were in federal custody, and that Elias Creed himself had been located at a ranch outside Dodge City and arrested by a separate federal detachment that same afternoon. She had pulled him inside and made him sit down and cleaned the cut on his cheek herself with careful hands, and he sat very still under her hands the way he went still when he was feeling something large, and when she finished and looked at him, his eyes were bright with something she thought might be tears, though she did not mention it because there are things a proud man needs handled with gentleness. "Is it over?" she asked. "Fitch believes the federal case is solid enough to hold them through trial," he said. "Yes. I believe it is over." She kissed him gently near the cut on his cheek. "Then it is over," she said. They were married in April at the Coldwater Creek Church, which was a plain wooden building that held 40 people, and was filled to comfortable capacity for the occasion, because Thomas Quinn had been a neighbor of good character for 4 years, and Lavinia Monroe had been the kind of neighbor who asked nothing, but gave everything when asked, and people on the frontier remembered that and showed up to celebrate it. The ceremony was performed by Reverend Aldis Dowd, who was a man of considerable length both in person and in sermon, but who had the decency to keep the wedding service brief and specific, and Thomas and Lavinia stood before him and said what needed to be said with the clarity of 2 people who had already said everything else and knew exactly what they were committing to. Thomas's ring on Lavinia's finger was a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother, which he had carried in his saddlebag for 11 years for a reason he had not been entirely conscious of until he had a reason. She held his hand at the altar and felt the slight roughness of his working man's fingers and thought that there was nothing in the world more real than this, no more solid or more true than standing beside a person you had chosen with full knowledge and clear eyes. After the ceremony, the town turned out a celebration in the church yard that ran into the evening with tables of food and a fiddle player from 3 miles out, and the particular warmth of a frontier community that did not often have occasion to celebrate and made the most of it when it did. Thomas danced with her twice, which was notable because he was not a man who danced easily, and the second dance was slow, and he held her with a careful propriety in public that was undermined by the way he held her gaze, and she felt the same as she had in the flood water, which was that she was going to love this man for the rest of her life, and was no longer frightened by that knowledge, but rather sustained by it. Summer arrived, and with it the particular joy of building something in common. They combined their operations formally, a decision that made practical and legal sense, but was more than practical and legal. It was the full merging of 2 separate projects of survival into one shared project of living. The Quinn spread, which was the larger and more established operation, became the base, and they expanded the combined herd carefully. Thomas's cattleman's judgment and Lavinia's particular eye for animal health working together, with a complementarity that surprised neither of them but still pleased them both considerably. The soddy on Lavinia's original claim was cleaned out and used as storage while they improved the main house on the Quinn spread, adding a proper wooden structure alongside the original soddy that Thomas had built his first 2 years. Lavinia had opinions about the house and expressed them directly, and Thomas listened with the particular quality of attention that meant he was actually taking in what was said rather than waiting for a pause to respond. And the house that emerged from those conversations was something neither of them would have built alone, better for being the product of two separate visions. In the evenings they sat on the porch of the new house as the summer nights cooled and talked, or did not talk, which was its own kind of talking for them. Thomas had a habit in those evenings of reaching over and taking her hand without preamble, just reaching and taking, as if the contact was so natural it did not require introduction, and she loved this habit with a specificity she had not expected. She had not known that she was a person who needed to be reached for. She had built herself so thoroughly into self-sufficiency that the needs underneath had grown quiet and hidden, and Thomas's steady, habitual reaching had a way of finding them. In August, she told him she was going to have a child. He was at the fence line when she told him, working a section of post that had loosened in the summer heat, and he turned from the fence and looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she started to read his expression carefully. And then she saw it break open in the way that happened only occasionally, the full, unguarded thing, a joy so complete and real that it was almost startling to see on his otherwise contained face. He crossed the ground between them and held her face in his hands and looked at her with that expression and did not say anything for a full 10 seconds. "A child," he said finally. "In late February, I think," she said. He kissed her forehead and then held her against him in the way he had that was not protective so much as simply present, simply there. And she stood in the circle of his arms in the August heat and felt the full accumulated weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. The widow's grief and the trail west and the flood crossing and the dark letter and the marshals and the slow, deliberate building of trust between two damaged and determined people, and felt it as weight not burden but ballast. The kind of weight that keeps a ship right in rough water. Their son was born in the last days of February 1880, which was not the easiest winter Kansas had offered but not the worst either, and the birth was attended by the local physician Dr. Emmett Crane, who made the trip from town in the dark with Thomas Quinn riding ahead to summon him, with an urgency that Lavinia later heard described by the doctor as both flattering and slightly terrifying. The child was strong and loud, and had Thomas's dark hair and Lavinia's particular way of looking at things with total focus, and they named him James Samuel Quinn, James for Thomas's father and Samuel for Lavinia's brother who had died of fever 8 years prior, and whom she still carried in her memory with the particular tenderness reserved for the young dead. Thomas held the boy for the first time with the same careful steadiness he brought to every fragile thing, and looked at his face for a long time with an expression Lavinia memorized and kept. The years that followed were the years that the promise of the frontier was either kept or broken, and for Lavinia and Thomas Quinn the promise was kept, which was not universal, and they knew it and did not take it as simply their due, but as something earned and also graced. The cattle operation grew steadily, not spectacularly, but steadily, with the kind of growth that comes from good judgment and consistent care rather than luck. They bought additional acreage in 1881, when the homestead claim of a family 3/4 of a mile west was abandoned after a second crop failure, and Thomas's rangeland grew to a size that allowed them to run a proper drive to Wichita each fall. Lavinia took on the bookkeeping and the correspondence of the operation with the same thoroughness she brought to everything, and she had a head for numbers and contracts that turned out to be valuable beyond the household scale. She was not a passive partner in the ranching, which Thomas had never expected or desired, and the quality of their working partnership was one of the satisfactions of his life that he sometimes articulated to her directly. In the plain way, he articulated the things he valued, which was always slightly surprising to her, because his silences were so eloquent that his words felt like gifts. James grew into a boy who was Thomas's son in his deliberateness and Lavinia's son in his curiosity, a combination that produced in practice a child who thought hard before acting, and then acted with total commitment, which were useful qualities on the frontier and would be useful everywhere else. The letter from the federal court in Topeka arrived in the spring of 1882, informing Thomas Quinn that the case against Elias Creed had concluded with a conviction and a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, and that the matters related to the Creed operation were considered fully closed by the prosecuting authority, with no outstanding questions regarding Thomas's status, which had been formally designated as a cooperating witness, whose prior association with the Creed outfit did not constitute criminal liability. Thomas had read this letter at the kitchen table with Lavinia across from him and James, 2 years old and entirely absorbed in a set of carved wooden blocks on the floor, and he had set the letter down and sat quietly for a moment and then said, "It is done." "All of it," she said. "All of it," he confirmed. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers the way she had at that first table in the old soddy in October of 1878. The same gesture but different now, weighted with everything that had come between that moment and this one. He turned his hand over and held hers, also the same, also different. "I never thanked you properly for those 2 days," he said, meaning the 2 days she had kept the letter and decided what she believed. "You thanked me by being exactly what I believed you were," she said. In the summer of 1883, their second child was born, a boy again, healthy and dark-eyed and tremendously loud, whom they named William Monroe Quinn, Monroe for Lavinia's family name, which pleased her more than she expressed to Thomas directly, but which he noticed in the way he noticed most things, which was quietly and completely. Will, as he would be called from the beginning, had a temperament that was everything his brother's was not, which is to say he was spontaneous and impulsive, and threw himself at the world with a full-bodied enthusiasm that kept both his parents in a state of permanent gentle alertness. The house had been expanded twice by then, properly now with lumber that Thomas had brought up from the sawmill in Wichita, and it was a solid, warm, well-made house that showed in its structure the particular character of the man who had built it, which was steadiness and careful precision, and the conviction that things done right were worth the extra time they required. Lavinia had a kitchen garden that she tended with genuine affection, the kind of productive domestic attention that was a luxury in her early frontier years, and had become a pleasure now that the worst of the survival pressure was past. She grew vegetables and herbs and 2 kinds of flowers that served no practical purpose whatsoever, and which Thomas never commented on except to note once, obliquely, that the garden looked particularly fine this year, which she received as the declaration of support it was. Their neighbors in Coldwater Creek knew them as the Quinns, as a unit, with the ease and naturalness that marriage was supposed to convey and sometimes did. Thomas had a reputation in the county for fair dealing and straight talk, which were the qualities a cattleman most needed, and Lavinia's reputation was of a different kind but complementary. The woman who organized the church relief drive during the hard winter of 1881, and who had quietly lent money to 3 different families whose spring planting was in jeopardy, and who expected repayment without interest, and in the time available rather than the time due, which was a distinction that mattered on the frontier and which people remembered. There were hard years within the good ones, because there always are, and the frontier was honest about this. The drought summer of 1884 was particularly brutal, and the cattle prices that fall were the worst in 4 years, and they tightened down to essentials with the same quiet practicality with which they did everything, without drama, without blame, with the particular kind of partnership that doesn't require the announcement of its strength, because the strength is evident in how it holds. They talked about the drought one evening on the porch while James, 4 years old, slept inside and Will, still an infant, slept in the cradle that Thomas had built himself from cedar because cradles had been one of the things Thomas had quietly built during Lavinia's second pregnancy without mentioning it until it was finished, which was exactly the kind of thing he did that continued to break her open in the best possible way. "We will need to reduce the herd," Thomas said. He was looking at the dry grass at the hard sky, stating a fact. "By how much?" she said. 15 head to start, perhaps 20 if August stays dry." She was quiet for a moment. They both knew what that meant in terms of the following spring's operation. "All right," she said. He looked at her then. "I am sorry," he said. "This land was supposed to be the thing that held." She turned to face him. "It is holding," she said. "We are holding. The herd is replaceable. What we are doing here is not." He held her gaze for a moment and then reached over in that habitual way and took her hand. And she felt the firmness of his grip and the warmth of it and thought again, as she had thought in many iterations over many years, that this was the most real thing she had ever known. The drought broke in September of 1884, not perfectly, but enough, and they rebuilt what they had sold off by the following spring, and by 1885 the operation was stronger than it had been before the drought year, partly because the reduction had forced them to be more selective about which animals they kept, and the herd that remained was better quality than it would have been without the pressure. James, at 5, had begun accompanying Thomas on morning rounds of the pasture, riding in front of his father on the saddle, with the focused attention of a child who understood he was learning something real. Thomas explained what he was doing as he did it, in the same direct and educational way he had once explained the door frame to Lavinia, and James absorbed it with the gravity of a small person taking a large responsibility seriously. Lavinia watched them go out on those mornings sometimes from the kitchen window, Thomas's broad back and James's small one in front, the boy pointing at something and Thomas bending slightly to see what had been noticed, and felt a fullness of feeling for which she did not have adequate language and therefore simply held, without language, as the most true thing she knew. In 1886, their third child came, and this time a daughter, which delighted them both and sent Thomas into a particular quality of tender protectiveness that Lavinia found both touching and slightly amusing. They named her Clara Ruth Quinn, Ruth for Thomas's mother whose ring was still on Lavinia's finger, and Clara for no more specific reason than that it suited the face they saw when they looked at her, which was a face of early and considerable determination. Thomas held Clara the same way he had held his sons, with that precise and careful steadiness, but there was something in his expression holding this daughter that was its own specific thing, a kind of wondering that he did not entirely conceal and did not try to, and Lavinia thought that, for a contained man, fatherhood had opened him in a way that nothing else had quite managed, which was its own profound pleasure to witness. The Coldwater Creek of 1887 was not the Coldwater Creek of 1878, and both Lavinia and Thomas were aware of this in the way you are aware of change that has happened gradually and all around you. The town had grown, the general store had competition, a proper hotel had replaced the saloon's rented rooms, a real school had been built, and a teacher had come from Ohio named Miss Hartwell who had opinions about arithmetic that James was beginning to test, with results that were academically mixed but characterologically revealing. The cattle business had become a more sophisticated enterprise as the railheads expanded, and the Chicago meatpackers began to exert more direct influence on Western cattle pricing, and Thomas navigated these changes with the same deliberate attentiveness he brought to everything, reading what he needed to read, adapting without panicking, holding to the core practices that made the operation sound while being willing to change the surrounding ones when change was warranted. Lavinia had, by this point, become an informal advisor to two other women homesteaders who had come to the county in recent years, younger women facing the same frontier she had faced in 1878, and she met with them regularly, and shared what she knew without the false modesty of someone who did not own her own experience. She knew things worth knowing. She had learned them at genuine cost. The passing of that knowledge to women who needed it felt like something important, like the particular satisfaction of a debt paid to the version of herself who had stood at the door of a crumbling soddy with a pry bar and made herself a promise not to cry. Thomas knew she did this and approved of it in the way he approved of the things he respected, which was by never trying to limit them, and by occasionally saying, simply, that he thought what she was doing mattered. On an evening in late autumn of 1887, they were on the porch in the last light, which was the red and gold light of a Kansas November late afternoon, the kind of light that made everything it touched look like a painting. And James was doing his arithmetic at the kitchen table with the door open, and Will was chasing the dog around the yard with his characteristic lack of strategy, and Clara was asleep in the house in the way that the youngest child of two active older brothers learns to sleep, which is through anything. Thomas was looking at the land, at the pasture that was his and was now also hers in every legal and practical sense, at the herd moving slowly at the far edge of the south field, at the good fence they had built and rebuilt and improved over 9 years of working this ground together. He had a coffee cup in his hand, and his legs were stretched out, and he had the look of a man who had arrived somewhere. Lavinia was beside him, and she was looking at the same things, the land and the herd and the particular quality of the light, and she was thinking about a Tuesday in August of 1878, when a man on a horse had ridden up with a pry bar and an economy of words and changed her life by not trying to take her tools away. "Thomas," she said. He said, which was the sound he made when he was comfortable and listening. "I am very glad you drove the wagon through the flood," she said. He turned and looked at her with the full depth of his particular gaze, that river-colored, unguarded thing. "I would drive it through anything," he said, and it was not a metaphor and it was not poetry. It was Thomas Quinn stating a fact as he understood it, which was the same as a declaration, the same as a vow, which was exactly why she trusted every word he said. She reached over and took his hand, which was her habit as much as his now, and felt his fingers close over hers with the same firmness they had held for 9 years. "I know," she said. The years beyond that evening continued in the way that good lives do when they have been built with care and honesty and sufficient love, which is to say, they moved forward with the regular mixture of joy and difficulty and small daily grace that constitutes a life well lived. James grew into a young man of steady character who had his father's hands and his mother's judgment, and by the early 1890s, he was working the ranch alongside Thomas with a competence that allowed Thomas to step back from some of the heavier physical demands without any loss of operation quality, which was a specific and practical gift that parents rarely name but always feel. Will remained Will, which was to say energetic and impulsive and broadly lovable, and he eventually apprenticed to a blacksmith in town who had the patience and the physical authority to channel Will's enthusiasm into something productive. And by 16, he was doing work that grown men respected and doing it with the wholehearted commitment he brought to everything he attempted. Clara, as her earliest expression had promised, was determined in a way that was remarkable even in a family where determination was the baseline. She read everything available in Coldwater Creek, and when that ran out she wrote to the school in Wichita for additional materials and received them, which said something about both her initiative and the school's response to a well-written letter from an 11-year-old. Thomas responded to his daughter's intellectual ferocity with a quiet pride that was the same quality he brought to everything he valued, and Lavinia watched him with Clara sometimes, and felt the particular joy of seeing a man who had no investment in limiting his daughter, because his only investment was in her becoming the fullest version of herself. In 1892, they expanded the house again, adding a proper room for Clara and consolidating some of the older additions that had been built in different wood and different years, and showed it. Thomas did the planning of the expansion with the same precision he had used on Lavinia's door frame in 1878, thinking it through before beginning and executing with care. And the house that stood at the end of 1892 was a solid and particular thing, built over 15 years in different pieces, but coherent. The way a life built over time is coherent if the person building it knows what they are doing. By 1895, they had been married for 16 years, and the ranch was one of the better regarded operations in the county, not the largest but sound and consistently well managed. Thomas's hair had gone partly silver at the temples, which Lavinia privately found absurdly distinguished on him, and the lines in his face had deepened with the years of sun and weather, but the eyes were the same, still that river-colored depth, still doing that unguarding occasionally in the way she had been watching for since August of 1878 and had never stopped finding arresting. She had not become old exactly, though she had become something more specific and more interesting than young, which was a woman who knew exactly who she was and had built the life to prove it. The dark hair she had started with was threaded with silver too, which she wore without apology, and she moved through her days with the particular ease of someone who has been tested by real things and found herself equal to them. They were on the porch again on a June evening of that year, which was where they often were in the evenings, it being the place they had always done their most real talking and their most companionable silence. The children were grown and mostly out in the world, though Clara was still at home, 17 and fierce with her reading and her plans, and the house was quieter than it had been in 15 years. Thomas said, "Do you ever think about what it would have been like if you had stayed in St. Louis?" This was not a question he asked often, and she considered it seriously. "I think about what I would have missed," she said, "which is considerable." "You would have been comfortable," he said, "more comfortable than this." "Comfortable is not what I wanted," she said. "I wanted real." He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant he was feeling something he was considering how to say. Then he said, "I think about sometimes what would have happened if the storm had been a week earlier, or if the ford had been higher, or if the wagon had gone over in that current." "It did not," she said. "No," he said, "it did not." He looked at her. "I need you to know that driving that wagon through that flood was the easiest choice I have ever made. Not because it was not dangerous, but because everything I wanted to protect was in it." She held his gaze for a long time. The evening light was doing the golden thing that Kansas evening light did, lying across the porch and across his face and across the land behind him, and she thought that there was no version of the world in which she would have chosen anything other than this specific man, this specific life, this particular accumulation of difficulty and grace that had made her who she was. "I know," she said, and reached over and took his hand. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat together in the evening light with the sound of the ranch around them, the cattle and the occasional call of a bird, and the particular silence of the Kansas plains that was different from any other silence in the world, as they had agreed long ago on a cold, gray afternoon in October of 1878, and it was the silence of a life fully built, fully inhabited, fully and honestly claimed. Clara came out with 2 fresh cups of coffee, setting them down with the careful deliberateness she brought to everything, and looked at her parents sitting with their hands together in the evening light, and went back inside without a word, which was its own kind of understanding. The stars came out over the Quinn ranch on a June evening in 1895, and Thomas Quinn and Lavinia Monroe sat under them with their hands together as they had been in one form or another for 17 years, and the flood was a long way behind them, and the distance they had traveled from it was the full and extraordinary length of a life built on the choice to cross it together. There was nothing unresolved between them. There was nothing unfinished or unnamed. There was only the solid, enduring, daily reality of what they had made, which was a home and a family and a partnership of such depth and completeness that it had long since become the air they breathed without noticing, the ground under their feet, the unchanging thing in a world that changed around it continuously. Thomas set down his coffee cup and looked at her in the starlight and said, in the simple declarative way, he said the things that mattered most to him. "I love you, Lavinia." She had heard this from him for 16 years, and it landed every time with the same specific weight, because he said it the way he said everything that was true, which was without performance and without qualification, and she received it the same way she always had. "I love you, Thomas," she said. And they sat together under the Kansas stars, and the ranch breathed around them, and the horses moved in the dark pasture, and Clara read by lamplight inside, and everything was exactly what they had made it, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.